Oskar Gröning, at 94 years old, is currently on trial in Germany, accused of being an accomplice in hundreds of thousands of murders while serving as an SS officer at Auschwitz during World War II. Last week, prosecutors requested a 3.5-year sentence for the former concentration camp guard, who admits moral guilt but denies having committed a crime, since he did not personally kill any of the prisoners. In 1942, when he was 21 years old, Oskar Gröning was assigned to Auschwitz. He almost immediately witnessed the arrival of a transport at the ramp, the platform where Jews disembarked. I was on the ramp, and my task was to be part of the group that supervised the luggage of an arriving transport. He watched as SS doctors separated men from women and children, and then selected who was fit to work and who was to be gassed immediately. Sick people were placed on trucks, Red Cross trucks. They always tried to create the impression that people had nothing to fear. He estimates that between 80% and 90% of those on the first transport he witnessed in September 1942 were selected for immediate execution. This selection process took place in a relatively organized manner, but when it was over, it was like a fairground. There was a pile of garbage, and beside that garbage were sick people, unable to walk, perhaps a child who had lost its mother, or perhaps someone who, while the train was being searched, had hidden, and these people were simply shot in the head. And the way these people were treated brought me doubt and indignation. A child was simply pulled by the leg and thrown onto a truck. Then, when it cried like a sick chicken, they threw it against the side of the truck. I couldn't understand how an SS man could grab a child and smash its head against the side of a truck, or kill them by shooting them and then toss them onto a truck like a sack of wheat. According to his account, Gröning was so filled with doubt and indignation that he went to his superior and said, "It's impossible. I can't work here any longer. If it's necessary to exterminate the Jews, then at least it should be done within a certain context." His superior calmly listened to Gröning's complaints, reminded him of the SS oath of loyalty he had sworn, and told him he should forget any idea of leaving Auschwitz. But he also offered some hope of sorts. He told Gröning that the excesses he had witnessed that night were an exception, and that he agreed that SS members should not participate in sadistic events of that kind. Documents confirm that Gröning later requested a transfer to the front lines, which was denied, so he continued working at Auschwitz. Gröning did not complain significantly to his superior about the principle of killing Jews, only about its practical implementation. When he saw people in front of him whom he knew would be dead within hours in the gas chambers, he says his feelings were very ambiguous. He says, "How do you feel when you are in Russia, with a machine gun in front of you, and there's a battalion of Russians running toward you, and you have to pull the trigger and shoot as much as possible? I say it that way on purpose because always behind you is the thought that the Jews are enemies coming from within Germany. Propaganda had such a great effect on us that you assumed exterminating them was basically something that happened in war, and to a certain extent, a feeling of sympathy or empathy didn't arise." When asked why the children were killed, Gröning replies, "The children are not the enemy at the moment. The enemy is the blood in them. The enemy is that they will grow up and become a Jew who could be dangerous." Clues as to how it was possible for Oskar Gröning to feel that defenseless women and children were enemies who had to face extermination can be found in his life before being sent to Auschwitz. Around the age of 20, without telling his father, Oskar went to a hotel where the Waffen-SS was recruiting and enlisted. When he returned home, his father said, "I was hoping that, since you wear glasses, you wouldn't be accepted." Committed to the nationalist cause, his father was reluctant to see his son go off to war. What Oskar Gröning obtained as a member of that elite corps was, initially, a job in the SS administration as a clerk. He worked as a clerk for a year until September 1942, when the order came that healthy SS members working in payroll administration centers would be transferred to more demanding duties, reserving administrative jobs for veterans returning disabled from the front lines. So, under the assumption that we would now be entering a combat unit, about 22 of us packed our luggage and took a train to Berlin. It was very strange, because usually an order would have come for us to go to a troop assembly location, but that didn't happen. Then Gröning and his comrades arrived at Auschwitz. Up to that point, Oskar Gröning's personal experience at Auschwitz was that it was a normal concentration camp for the detention of political prisoners or other enemies of the state, though one in which the rations for SS members were particularly good. However, when he began his task of recording the prisoners' money, he learned for the first time about the additional and unusual function of Auschwitz. The people working there in the barracks informed us that this money did not all go back to the prisoners. Jews were brought into the camp and treated differently. Their money was taken from them without being returned. Gröning asked, "Does this have to do with the transport that arrived during the night?" His colleagues replied, "Well, don't you know? That's how it is here. Transports of Jews arrive, and to the extent that they are not capable of working, they are eliminated." Gröning pressed them on what eliminated really meant, and, after being told, said his reaction was one of shock. It was a shock, something you cannot comprehend at first. But you must not forget that it wasn't only from Hitler's rise to power in 1933, but even before that, the propaganda I received as a boy in the press, in the media, in the general society in which I lived, made us realize that the Jews were the cause of the First World War and had also stabbed Germany in the back. Gröning arrived at Auschwitz just as the Nazi extermination machine was operating at an unrelentingly efficient pace of destruction. In the summer of 1942, shortly before Gröning's arrival, Auschwitz was receiving transports of Jews from all over Europe, including Slovakia, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. After working in Auschwitz for several months, Gröning said his work had become routine. He organized the various currencies that had been taken from the newcomers, counted the money, and sent it to Berlin. He also took part in the selections, not to participate in the decision-making process about who should live and who should die, as those decisions were made by SS doctors, but to ensure that the belongings of the Jews were collected and kept safe until they could be sorted. Gröning created for himself what he considered a tolerable life in Auschwitz. In his office, he was isolated from the brutality, and when he walked through the camp, he could avert his eyes from anything that displeased him. Under normal circumstances, he had nothing to do with the coarse mechanics of the killing process. There was usually no reason for him to visit the remote corner of Birkenau, where the killings took place. The only reminder that different nationalities were arriving at the camp was the variety of currencies that passed across his desk. We didn't feel empathy or sympathy for one or another group of Jews from a specific country, unless you were interested in getting a particular type of vodka or schnapps. The Russians had a great kind of vodka. We drank a lot of vodka. We didn't get drunk every day, but it happened. The main Auschwitz camp was like a small town. It had its rumors. It had a vegetable shop where you could buy bones to make broth. There was a canteen, a cinema, a theater with regular performances. There was a sports club of which I was a member. There were dances. Everything was fun and entertainment. And then there was the other positive side of life in Auschwitz for Oskar Gröning, his comrades. I have to say that many who worked there weren't boring. They were intelligent. When he finally left the camp in 1944, he left with some regrets. I had left behind a circle of friends I had become familiar with, grown fond of, and that was very difficult. Apart from the fact that there are people who satisfy their personal impulses, there are such people. The special situation in Auschwitz led to friendships that I still say today, I remember with joy. But one night, at the end of 1942, Gröning's comfortable life in Auschwitz was disturbed by a sudden glimpse of the nightmare behind the killing operation. Sleeping in his barracks in the SS camp on the outskirts of Birkenau, he and his comrades were awakened by the sound of an alarm. They were told that several Jews being taken to the gas chambers had escaped and run into the nearby forest. We were told to grab our pistols and go through the forest. We didn't find anyone. He and his comrades spread out and made their way to the extermination area of the camp. We formed a star-shaped formation toward this farmhouse. It was lit from the outside with diffused light, and in front of it were 7 or 8 bodies. These were probably the ones who had tried to escape and were caught and shot. In front of the farmhouse door stood some SS men who told us, "It's over, you can go home." Curious, Gröning and his comrades decided not to go home, but instead to stay in the shadows. They watched as an SS man put on a gas mask and dropped Zyklon B pellets through an opening in the wall of the house. There was a humming sound coming from inside that turned into screams for a minute, followed by silence. Then a man, I don't know if he was an officer, stood up and went to the door, where there was a peephole, looked inside and checked if everything was all right and if the people were dead. The sight of the gassing facilities and the burning cremation pits on that winter night in 1942 momentarily shattered the cozy, ordinary life Oskar Gröning had built for himself in Auschwitz. So much so that he again went to his superior, an SS Untersturmführer, lieutenant, who was an Austrian and basically an honest guy, and confided in him. He listened to me and said, "My dear Gröning, what do you want to do about it? We're all in the same boat. We have committed ourselves to accept this, not even to think about it." With his superior officer's words echoing in his ears, Gröning went back to work. He had sworn an oath of loyalty, believed that the Jews were enemies of Germany, and knew he could still manage his life in the camp to avoid confronting the worst of the horror. And so he stayed until 1944, when his request for transfer to a frontline unit was finally granted, and he joined an SS unit fighting in the Ardennes. After being wounded and sent to a field hospital, he rejoined his unit before finally surrendering to the British on June 10, 1945. Gröning then became a prisoner of war, while those who suffered Nazi persecution faced distinctly mixed fates after the end of the conflict. Their SS perpetrators knew for certain, from the moment of Germany's surrender, that they risked arrest and prosecution, just as Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who built the gas chambers and crematoria that made the camp infamous, sought to hide his past before being captured by the British and hanged in 1947. Gröning, a small cog in the Auschwitz machine, tried to do the same. Once SS members were in captivity, the British distributed questionnaires to all of them. Gröning wrote on the form that he had worked for the SS Office of Economics and Administration in Berlin. He did this not because he was suddenly overcome with shame about what had happened at Auschwitz, but because the victor is always right, and we knew that the things that happened there, in Auschwitz, were not always in accordance with human rights. Together with his SS comrades, Gröning was imprisoned in a former Nazi concentration camp. When he was finally released and returned to Germany in 1947, he discovered that he could not resume his old job at the bank because he had been a member of the SS. So he got a job in a glass factory and began the long climb up the management ladder. He continued his policy of trying not to draw undue attention to his time at Auschwitz, to the point of insisting that his immediate family erase their memories as well. Once, shortly after his return to Germany, he was sitting at the dinner table with his father and in-laws when they made a silly comment about Auschwitz, implying that he was a potential or actual murderer. "I exploded," says Gröning. "I banged my fist on the table and said, 'That word and that connection must never, ever be mentioned again in my presence, or else I'm leaving.' I spoke loudly, and that was respected and never mentioned again." Thus, the Gröning family settled down and began building a future for themselves in post-war Germany, enjoying the fruits of the German economic miracle. While Gröning forced himself and his family to forget the atrocities at Auschwitz, it seemed for a time that the world was doing the same. It would take years before the site of the atrocities at Auschwitz was properly maintained and cared for. In fact, only well after the fall of communism were the signs at the museum finally changed to appropriately reflect the suffering of the Jews. Meanwhile, Gröning steadily rose through the administrative ranks of the glass factory where he now worked, eventually becoming head of personnel. He was finally appointed an honorary judge in cases before the industrial court. Without seeing any sense of irony or impropriety in his words, Oskar Gröning believed that the experience he gained in the SS and the Hitler Youth helped him perform his duties as a personnel officer better, because from the age of 12 I learned about discipline. Although he worked in Auschwitz and assisted in the extermination process by sorting and counting the foreign money stolen from arriving transports, Gröning never considered himself guilty of any crime. We drew a line between those who were directly involved in the killing and those who were not directly involved. Furthermore, he felt that he was, using the infamous post-war Nazi defense, merely following orders. This was, perhaps surprisingly, a similar line to that adopted by West German prosecutors after the war, when determining who from Auschwitz should face war crimes charges and who should not. If an SS member did not hold a senior leadership position or was not directly involved in the killing, he generally escaped prosecution. Thus, when Oskar Gröning's past was eventually discovered, inevitably, since he never made any attempt to change his name or go into hiding, German prosecutors did not indict him. His experience therefore demonstrates how it was possible to have been a member of the SS, worked at Auschwitz, witnessed the extermination process, contributed concretely to the final solution by sorting stolen money, and yet not be considered guilty by the post-war German state. In fact, of the roughly 6,500 SS members who worked at Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945 and are believed to have survived the war, fewer than 800 received any form of punishment. The most notorious legal proceeding was the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt, held between December 1963 and August 1965, when, out of 22 defendants, 17 were convicted, and only 6 received the maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Concluding Gröning's story. In December 2017, the German Constitutional Court upheld the conviction of the Lüneburg Court and rejected the appeal filed by the convicted man against his imprisonment, citing reasons of age and his frail health. The defendant attended the trial sessions with the help of a walker. The trial against Gröning lasted 4 months and was part of a series of late prosecutions opened in recent years for Nazi crimes. The defendant admitted his moral complicity in the deaths at Auschwitz, the deadliest of the Nazi extermination camps located in occupied Poland, where he was responsible for confiscating and managing the money and belongings of those who arrived as deportees. Gröning expressed remorse and asked forgiveness from the survivors and families of the victims, while lamenting that he had not acted decisively against the crimes which, as he said, he was fully aware of. He ultimately died at the age of 96 in 2018. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.